Welcome. Today we're doing a deep dive into a really significant piece of thinking in international relations, Samuel P. Huntington's The Clash of Civilizations.
That's right. It's a framework that emerged, after the Cold War ended, and it tried to figure out what would drive global conflict next, now that the big ideological fight was over.
And our goal here is to really unpack it for you. Look at the main arguments, where they came from, what Huntington predicted, and crucially, how well it holds up today. Does it help us understand the world, or does it fall short?
hmm We'll be drawing mainly from his original 1993 article in Foreign Affairs and the book that followed in 96, plus how people have analyzed it since.
Okay, so the Berlin Wall is down, the Soviet Union is gone, the old map doesn't work. What was Huntington's big idea about the new lines of conflict?
Well, Huntington's core argument really was that the main driver of conflict was shifting. It wasn't going to be ideology anymore, capitalism versus communism. He argued it was going to be cultural.
Culture, okay. And how did he see these cultural divisions playing out, like globally?
He proposed that the world is basically divided into maybe 7 or 8 major civilizations. These are the biggest cultural groupings people belong to, defined by things like shared religion, history, language, traditions, and how people see themselves.
Can you list some of those he identified?
Sure. He talked about Western, Confucian, sometimes called Sinic, Japanese, Islamic, Hindu, Slavic Orthodox, Latin American. And he also considered if there was a distinct African civilization emerging.
So it's these massive cultural blocks, not just countries. And the idea was that the trouble starts where they border each other.
Exactly. He predicted the really significant conflicts, the dangerous ones, would happen along what he called the fault lines, separating these civilizations.
Right. This idea really took off in the early to mid-90s. What was going on in the world then that might have led him to think this way?
Well, it was a period of huge uncertainty, wasn't it?
Yeah.
The old Cold War certainties were gone, and people were looking for new ways to understand things. Plus, there were conflicts emerging that seemed to fit the pattern.
What kind of conflicts are we talking about?
Think about the breakup of Yugoslavia. I mean, that was heavily driven by ethnic and religious differences, right?
Yeah.
The Gulf War also brought interactions between the West and parts of the Islamic world into sharp focus, highlighting cultural dimensions.
Another thing.
Yeah, even things like the genocide in Rwanda, tragically, pointed to the power of group identity. Huntington also saw what he called indigenization, non-Western societies looking back to their own cultural roots, pushing back against Western influence.
But what about globalization? That was really taking off too. Wouldn't more connection reduce these divisions?
That's the interesting paradox Huntington pointed out. He argued that, yes, there's more interaction, but that very interaction actually makes people more aware of the differences between their civilization and others. It kind of sharpens the sense of us versus them.
Okay, so it doesn't dilute identity, it strengthens it, in his view.
That was his argument. Instead of homogenization, you get a heightened awareness of civilizational identity, which could then fuel conflict.
Got it. So these civilizations, how did he actually define them? What makes a civilization in his framework?
He defined it as the broadest level of cultural identity people have, short of what makes us all human. It's based on objective things like language, history, religion, customs, institutions, but also subjective things, how people identify themselves.
So it's partly tangible things and partly a feeling of belonging.
Precisely. And he saw these as very long-lasting entities, very durable, persisting even when politics and economics change. He put a lot of weight on religion, actually, seeing it as a really core element of civilizational identity.
Okay, so we have these big, enduring cultural blocks defined partly by religion. Based on this, what were some of the key things Huntington predicted would happen?
Well, we've mentioned the big one, fault line conflicts happening at the borders between civilizations. He also argued these conflicts would be particularly nasty, more intense, harder to resolve, because they're about fundamental identity and values, not just territory or resources.
What else did he foresee? Any other major shifts?
Yes, he predicted that non-Western civilizations would increasingly push back against Western dominance, challenging Western power and values. He even floated the idea of a possible Confucian-Islamic connection.
A Confucian-Islamic connection, like an alliance.
Not necessarily a formal military alliance, but maybe a sort of strategic alignment, a convergence of interests, mainly aimed at counterbalancing perceived Western influence or interference.
Interesting. And what about the West's position?
He argued the West was in a period of relative decline compared to the rising power of other civilizations, especially in Asia. He thought the West needed to recognize this shift and adapt.
So adjust to a new reality, basically.
Yes, and related to that, he cautioned the West against trying to universalize its values too forcefully or making too many cultural concessions. He advocated for preserving unique Western values and institutions. His ultimate prescription for avoiding major war was accepting this new reality, a multipolar world with multiple civilizations coexisting, without one trying to remake the others in its own image.
That's a pretty stark vision. How did people react when he first published this? Must have made some waves.
Oh, absolutely. It sparked an immediate and very heated debate. Academics, policymakers, everyone seemed to have an opinion. Some found it really compelling, a useful new lens after the Cold War, especially for explaining conflicts that seemed driven by culture or religion. It challenged the more optimistic end of history idea that was also around then.
But clearly not everyone bought it. What were the main criticisms?
No, definitely not universal acceptance. A major criticism was that it smacked of cultural determinism, the idea that conflict between these groups was somehow inevitable. Critics worried this could become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
That makes sense. If you expect conflict, you might act in ways that bring it about.
Exactly. Others argued he seriously overstated how unified these civilizations actually are. Take the Islamic world. It's incredibly diverse, culturally, politically, theologically. Lumping it all together was seen as a major oversimplification.
And didn't some people worry about stereotypes?
Yes, that was a huge concern. Critics felt the theory could easily reinforce negative stereotypes, especially about Islam. Edward Said, for example, famously critiqued it as a kind of updated Orientalism, drawing these simplistic and potentially dangerous lines between us and them.
And then 9/11 happened. How did that affect the debate?
Well, 9/11 brought the thesis roaring back into the conversation. Some people pointed to it and said, see, Huntington was right. But others pushed back hard, arguing that 9/11 was the act of a specific extremist group with political goals, not some inevitable clash between entire civilizations. The debate became even more intense, really.
Okay, let's dig into those criticisms a bit more. Looking back now, what do we see as the main weaknesses or limitations of the theory?
Well, one of the biggest issues, as we touched on, is the way he drew the lines between civilizations. The categories themselves are pretty problematic. They don't really capture all the diversity within each supposed civilization, nor do they account for all the connections and overlaps between them.
Like the Islamic civilization example you gave.
Exactly. Vast differences get papered over. Another major point is that the theory doesn't do a great job explaining conflict within civilizations. If you actually look at the wars fought since the early 90s, a huge number, maybe even most, have been internal conflicts or conflicts between states. Huntington would put in the same civilization.
So it predicts conflict between blocks, but most conflict isn't actually between those blocks.
Pretty much. Think about conflicts in the Middle East or parts of Africa. They are often internal or regional, driven by politics, ethnicity, resources, sectarianism, things happening inside these civilizational lines.
Right. What else?
Critics also argue it downplays other really important drivers of conflict. Good old-fashioned power politics, economic competition, fights over resources, national interests, the actions of specific leaders or groups. These often explain conflicts much better than just saying civilizations are clashing.
And the idea that these civilizations are fixed things.
That's another key weakness. It tends to treat civilizations as these monolithic, unchanging blocks. But cultures are constantly evolving, interacting, borrowing from each other. Boundaries are way more fluid and fuzzy than the theory suggests. And, as mentioned before, this essentializing can easily lead to stereotyping, painting entire groups with one brush, often negatively.
Okay, so there are some quite serious limitations, but you mentioned earlier that some people found it insightful. Were there aspects that did offer some value, things he got right?
Yes. Despite the flaws, I think it's fair to say Huntington did put his finger on some important things. He really highlighted the significance of culture and religion in international affairs. At a time when a lot of analysis was focused purely on economics or state power, he insisted these identity factors still mattered, maybe even mattered more after the Cold War.
He brought culture back into the conversation, essentially.
In a big way, yes. And specifically, his focus on the revival of religion as a political force was quite prescient. Many theories predicted secularization would just continue, but Huntington saw religion making a comeback as a major factor in identity and political mobilization around the world.
What about the power shifts he predicted?
I think he was broadly correct about the rise of non-Western powers and their challenge to Western dominance, particularly the growing influence of countries in Asia, like China. The world has become more multipolar. While the specific Confucian-Islamic connection hasn't really panned out as a major strategic bloc, the underlying point about shifting power balances was accurate.
So even if the overall framework is flawed, it forced people to think about culture and identity in new ways.
Absolutely. It pushed the field of international relations to take culture seriously. How do cultural differences affect diplomacy, alliances, the way conflicts play out? Even if you disagree strongly with his conclusions, he undeniably raised crucial questions.
So given these insights and the criticisms, how should we, especially students of IR, approach this theory today? How do we move beyond its limitations?
I think the key is nuance. We need to acknowledge that culture matters, yes, but avoid those rigid monolithic categories. Recognize that people have multiple identities, national, ethnic, religious, professional, that often cut across these broad civilizational lines.
And connect culture to other factors.
Exactly. We need to look at how culture interacts with economics, politics, institutions, historical context. It's rarely just one thing driving events. And critically, we have to reject the deterministic idea that difference automatically means conflict. History is full of examples of fruitful cross-cultural exchange and cooperation.
So look for connection as well as division.
Right. Focus on shared challenges too. Climate change, pandemics, economic stability. These often require cooperation across cultural or civilizational lines. It's about respecting diversity, but also finding common ground based on shared interests and, frankly, our shared humanity.
Okay, thinking about the world right now, today's geopolitics. How relevant does Huntington's thesis feel? Do current events seem to fit his model or contradict it?
You know, it's a really mixed picture. You can definitely point to some things and say, that looks a bit like what Huntington talked about. The increased tension between Russia and the West, for example, often involves rhetoric about distinct values and Slavic Orthodox identity.
And China's rise.
China's rise certainly challenges Western preeminence, as he predicted. But is it fundamentally a civilizational clash, or is it more about economic competition, strategic rivalry, political systems? It's complex, probably a mix of factors, not just Confucian versus Western values.
What about the West and the Islamic world fault line? That seems central to his argument.
There are clearly ongoing tensions, absolutely. But again, are they driven by an inherent clash between monolithic civilizations? Or are they more about specific political issues, interventions, support for certain regimes? The actions of extremist groups who definitely don't represent billions of Muslims, historical grievances, many would argue it's the latter.
And you also see cooperation.
Right, loads of it. Massive trade flows, scientific collaboration, diplomatic efforts on global problems like climate change, all happening across these supposed civilizational divides. And, as we keep saying, many of the worst conflicts are within these blocks, not between them.
So many of today's big issues don't really fit the mold.
Not neatly, no.
Yeah.
Things like technological change, artificial intelligence, global supply chains, migration patterns, inequality, these are huge forces shaping our world, and they operate across and within civilizational lines. This simple picture of clashing civilizations just doesn't capture the full complexity we see today.
So wrapping this up then, how should we ultimately view Huntington's clash of civilizations today? What's the final takeaway for someone studying international relations?
I'd say approach it critically, but with an open mind. Recognize it as a really influential theory, one that asks important questions, even if its answers were flawed or incomplete. It powerfully highlighted that culture and identity matter in world politics, which was a valuable corrective at the time.
But don't take it as gospel.
Definitely not. For scholars, it's a prompt to do more nuanced research on how culture interacts with other factors, avoiding essentialism. For policymakers, it's maybe a reminder to develop cultural intelligence, understand different perspectives, but be wary of falling into simplistic us versus them thinking based on these broad categories.
So its value might be more in the questions it raised than the answers it gave.
I think that's a good way to put it. The questions about identity, culture, and conflict in a globalizing world are still incredibly relevant, even if we need more sophisticated frameworks than Huntington provided to grapple with them effectively.
Okay, so summing up, Huntington's Clash of Civilizations was this powerful, maybe provocative lens for the post-Cold War world. It really emphasized culture and religion when maybe others weren't focusing on them enough.
Right, it made a big impact.
But as we've discussed, his predictions of massive civilizational wars haven't quite panned out like he suggested. And the framework itself faces serious critiques, oversimplifying cultures, downplaying politics and economics, potentially feeding stereotypes.
Significant limitations.
Yet it did flag up important dynamics, the resurgence of identity politics, the shifting global power balance that we still need to understand.
Absolutely. And perhaps the enduring question it leaves us with, especially for you thinking about international relations, is this. In a world that's both more connected and seemingly more fragmented, is the real challenge a clash between these big civilizational blocs? Or is it something more complicated, a struggle within societies and across them to manage difference, find common values, and cooperate in this messy, multipolar reality we inhabit? That's something worth keeping in mind.